Next on the list are the connecting rods. It'll be nice to be working on something that's a bit easier for me to hold and see after dealing with the expansion links and their associated parts. These should be fairly simple to make, and I'll be taking an approach not too dissimilar than the one I took for the coupling rods. Don's design calls out that both the small end and the big end are to be 1/4 of an inch thick. I'm going to be using 6mm flat bar, so mine will be slightly thinner. There will of course be knock-on implications on a number of different parts, and I'll cover those off when I come to them. I start with a couple of lengths of 6x25mm flat bar. I clamp them together in the machine vise and clean up one end. This will be my reference end going forwards. Although the big end bearings will be rectangular in shape, I drill and ream an 8mm hole at their centres, and as usual I work my way up with a series of drills before finishing off with the reamer. I then do the same at the other end for the small end bearings. I will need to clean up that horrible scratch. With the worst of the scratch removed, I've applied some blue and marked out the outline. I've also turned a couple of pins at 8mm diameter, which I'll now use to keep the two rods aligned. I go on to drill a series of holes around the big end. These will eventually form the radius corners on the profile. I do the same for the small ends, but as one of the holes will break through the edge of the stock, I do end up using a slot drill for that hole. The downside to this approach for making connecting rods is the need to remove so much material from the stock. So I clamp the rods into the machine vise and use a slot drill to rough cut the top side. After a few passes I quite like the results, so rather than just rough cut I reposition the rods in the vise using a parallel in the top of the vise as a guide and continue on down to a finish cut. I'm only taking off 1/2 mil each pass, so it does take quite a bit of time. With the top side done, I go on to do the same for the bottom. For the small ends, I first use a hacksaw to remove as much of the material as is practical, and then in a break from my normal approach, where I would use a rotary table in the milling machine, I decide to file the profile, and of course using a couple of hardened silver steel buttons as a guide. The transition between the round section of the small ends and the main rods was a bit tricky, but I'm pleased with the result. For the big ends I drill a 3mm diameter hole in each of the 4 corners for the bearing. And then use a slot drill to rough out the middle. Whilst I'm at it, I use the same slot drill to rough out the top profile. I did intend to open out the recess for the bearings using some files, but I decided instead to carry on in the milling machine, so I use a 3mm slot drill, taking very small cuts all the way around. Although the burrs are making it look quite scruffy, I think the results are much better than if I'd tried to file it. And that is confirmed after a bit of a clean-up. To thin the rods, I've made a bit of a crude jig. As we can see here, I've got a lump of square bar clamped down onto the mill table. I've drilled two 8mm holes in the bar to allow me to bolt each one of the connecting rods in place. And because I've opened out the recess for the bearing at the big end, I've turned a little spacer to ensure that the connecting rod sits level. Before I tighten up the bolt at this end, I do put a temporary clamp against the middle of the connecting rod to ensure that it is held tight against the jig, just in case there's any bow in the rod. Now it's a simple job of using an end mill to thin this side of the rod. In terms of the extent of the thinning, I've done this very much by eye, so it's not scientific. But I have noted on the DRO the start and the finish position of the cut, therefore ensuring that both sides of both the rods are cut the same. As is normal for me, I do this with repeated cuts. I'm taking off 0.2mm each pass, down to a total of 0.6mm on this side. You may have wondered why my jig consists of a piece of bar clamped down on top of another piece of bar. And if it's not obvious, it's to allow me to swap the connecting rod over top to bottom, so I can repeat exactly the same cut on the other side. Before I tighten up the bolts on this side, I do add a couple of pieces of shim to account for the material that's been removed from that side. And then of course it's just a case of repeating the cuts on this side. To finish off the rods, I get to work with some files and emery to clean them up and remove any marks and scratches. I can't fit the rods just yet because I don't have any phosphor bronze bar big enough to make the big end bearings, and I'm also waiting delivery of a 5.5mm reamer for the small end. So I'll wrap this video up here, and as always say thanks for watching.